In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we have a little bit of a break in the flow of thought, but it seems that it's an important balance point to some things Paul's been saying through chapters 8 and 9. He's been highlighting how, as believers, we have freedoms, we have rights, but that we should use those rights in service of others. But in chapter 10, he says, don't think that I mean that anything is fine. There is still a sense in which the people of God should live a consecrated life, set apart as holy. Even with his own thoughts about his life at the end of chapter 9, he says, I am willing to serve those who do not have the law as if I am one that does not have the law. But he throws in a little comment, I am under Christ's law. And so in certain ways, maybe 1 Corinthians 10 is him expanding on what it means to be under Christ's law. And much like in 1 Corinthians 5, he uses the Old Testament narrative and some of the imagery of the Old Testament people of God to lay over the top of our current situation as New Testament people of God and say that spiritual heritage and the way God worked in his people is an opportunity for us to consider how in our time, in our place, we can live faithful to him. And so in some surprising ways, he looks back at the journey of the Israelites coming out of Egypt, wandering through the wilderness as a way for us to see our lives here in the world. And so he talks about how he wants them to know that our ancestors, our spiritual ancestors, even though some of the people he's talking to are Jews and some are Gentiles, they were under the cloud and they passed through the sea. And in verse 2 he even says they were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So he's talking about how the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night guided the people, but probably even more specifically, the cloud imagery is the law that was given at Mount Sinai, where the cloud representing God's presence engulfed the mountain. He gave the law to Moses, and he helped the people cross through the Red Sea. And this under the cloud, through the sea, being a way of talking about God's bringing them into this new life as his people. They've been under slavery. They were the descendants of Abraham. They're his people, but this is a solidification of the covenant he has with them through the law and through their deliverance. So that is what God did for them. He loved them, but as it was, he was not pleased with most of them, it says. They went through all of this. They were provided for by God. He goes on to describe the spiritual food they ate, the spiritual drink they drank, the manna, the water from the rock, the quail, these things that God did to sustain them. Nevertheless, their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And of course, only a couple of them, Caleb and Joshua, made it into the promised land out of that first generation of people who left Egypt. And so he's saying this is an ominous warning for us. He goes as far as saying that these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things. He says these are written down for our benefit. Of course, it was important in the time and place that it occurred, but he's saying through what we now understand through Christ, these stories in some ways are more for us than they were even for the immediate circumstances of the people of that time. And he goes through a number of key negative moments in the wilderness journey and says, here's what happens when you step outside of God's protective covering of his law and guidance. And so he talks first about idolatry. He says, do not be idolaters as some of them were. And then he quotes from Exodus 32:6, where it says they sat down and they got up and engaged in revelry. And the incident that he's referring to here is the golden calf situation. Moses is taking a while up on the mountain, and so they get aimless, they get restless, and so Aaron makes a golden calf to represent God, saying, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. Totally inappropriate. They should have been patient. They should have stayed focused on what God was doing. Instead, they took matters into their own hands and committed the sin of idolatry. So he says, don't do that. Next, he mentions sexual immorality. Do not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. The incident he's describing here is from Numbers chapter 25, where The people of God had started to have romantic relationships with some of the people around them, the Moabites. This led to further idolatry, but it was sexual immorality. And that event ends with Phinehas taking a spear and actually stabbing it through two people in the act of adultery. And God actually commends that. He says, he's as zealous for my honor as I am. And so the discipline that they were experiencing through that time came to an end because of Phinehas's act. But in the meantime, Numbers 25, verse 9 says that 24,000 people died. And perhaps here, the contradiction between 23,000 and 24,000 is that Paul's saying actually 23,000 of them died on a day. And then the remaining 1,000 died in the days that followed. But the point being, God actually intervened and brought an end to the physical life of some of the people who were living at that time who were engaging in sexual immorality. The third incident he highlights is we should not test Christ as some of them did and were killed by snakes. This is referring to Numbers 21 and that time when poisonous snakes actually came and were biting the people because of their lack of trust in God and the degree to which they were wanting to turn back and go to Egypt. And in Numbers 21, Moses builds a bronze snake, and they look at the snake, and they are healed from the venom of the snakes. And of course, Jesus uses that imagery later to talk about his own crucifixion, that just as the snake was taken up in the wilderness, whoever looked at it lived, he will be lifted up, and whoever comes to him will live. So that punishment and provision from God in Numbers 21 is brought back to our memory to say, don't put God to the test. And then finally, he says, and do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. This is probably talking about number 16, where Korah and his associates lead a rebellion and disregard the things of God, and the people as a whole are grumbling against Aaron and Moses and their leadership. And actually, there's a series of events that is described in that chapter. It's a little challenging because it says the destroying angel, but these three events each have their own features. Korah and his associates are swallowed up by the land. Then it says that fire came out from the sanctuary and consumed 250 people. And then there was a plague that killed another 14,700 people. And so this series of three events, Paul seems to be summing up as saying God's agent of destruction was at work to make a point here that you should not grumble against God and even against his agents as leaders in your life. And so this is all shocking stuff. It's a little bit strange to us, perhaps in our modern time, but it's an ominous reminder that God is serious and that he is asking for us to be loyal to him, faithful to him, in light of the fact that he's been nothing but loyal and faithful to us. And so, yes, we have freedom. Yes, we have some options with how we live our life. Paul has said in chapter 8 and 9 that really we shouldn't be judged by any other human, that their conscience should not be able to determine what we do, but yet in our hearts and minds, we need to still be devoted to God. And he brings that whole theme of the seriousness and devotion we should have to God back into some of the specific situation of Corinth, where there are people who could be tempted to still turn back to idolatry. They're in that Greco-Roman context, Temple of Aphrodite, Temple of Apollo up the road. There are very real idols still in their community where the believers could be tempted to turn back to those things. He draws attention again to communion and the way that that is a symbol of our community life. In chapter 11, he'll expand on that theme. But he's saying we shouldn't have participation with Christ and participation with idols. He actually goes as far in chapter 10 to say that when non-Christian people are sacrificing to idols, even though the idol itself is nothing, they are making sacrifices to demons. They are seeking to draw power, get favor from spiritual forces that the people of God should have nothing to do with. And so he says we can't have participation, fellowship with Christ at his table, eating the bread, drinking the wine that symbolizes his body and blood, and have be at the table of demons, participating with them. And so he reaffirms there's no power to the idol. There's no power to the food. He even quotes Psalm 24:1, where it says, the earth is the Lord and everything in it. So again, nothing wrong with the food. Idols aren't real, but there are spiritual forces that are real, and the people of God should not seek to have fellowship with them. They should have exclusive devotion to God. So the real operative issue is participation, not that the items themselves have any power. So he makes a little point of clarity there for some people who have this background in idolatry, saying the food is nothing, the idol's nothing, but the spiritual forces are real. So be dedicated exclusively to God. And he even invokes the imagery of the jealousy of God. Are we trying to arouse the Lord's jealousy? Verse 22. And this gets at so much of the imagery of the Old Testament, where the people of God, when they turn to idolatry, it's as if they are committing adultery. It's fascinating the way in the Old Testament and on a number of occasions, Ezekiel 16 may be one of the most vivid, that when people turn to idols, it's as if they have cheated on their husband. And God, as a faithful husband, has been nothing but faithful to them, but they are turning away to other lovers. And so idolatry, adultery, these things stir in the heart of God as a passionate lover, feeling appropriate jealousy that they would give their attention and affection to something else. He's saying we shouldn't do that. We are his covenant people. Jew, Gentile, whoever has faith in Christ, we are his people. And so using all of that imagery from the narrative of the Old Testament and the language of a jealous husband, he says, Paul says we need to be devoted to God. We should live it out in our morality. We should live it out in our practices as worshipers of him, and not dividing our loyalties to other things, but to come to him at his table, celebrating communion as an expression of our fellowship with him. So that's what he talks about in the first half, or a little bit more of the chapter. And then coming back around to the issue of freedom, he says in verse 23, I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. Verse 24, no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. So kind of coming back around to where he's been in chapter 8 and 9, he says, let's bring it back to the practical consideration of how my freedom should even be thought of in relationship to other people. So loyalty to God, consideration of others, these become the two dominant themes of how we should think about our freedom. So once again, he affirms in verse 25, you can eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience. He says in verse 27, if you go over to an unbeliever's house and they're offering you something to eat it without worrying that it's going to harm you. It's not going to contaminate you, even if it was sacrificed to an idol. But he says if they raise the fact that it was sacrificed to an idol into the conversation, abstain at that point, so that way it sends the message that you are not participants with demons. He again clarifies, I'm not saying someone else's conscience should govern your behavior. They aren't your judge, but out of consideration for them, let's be willing to choose what we eat and not eat based on how they might see it. And then he sums it all up in really what is one of my favorite verses in the whole book. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. And of course, this mention of eating and drinking is relevant in context because of this whole subject of food sacrifice to idols through chapters 8, 9, and now 10. So it makes sense that he would use those materials to discuss what it looks like to live a life that glorifies God. But I also think there's something fascinating here in that speaks to the mundane things of life. Every day we eat, we drink, we go about our business. And he's saying for the believer, even those mundane things can be done for the glory of God. And so yes, as it relates to the practical issue of idolatry in Corinth and living a consecrated life, let's think about how our eating and drinking draws attention to God. But for all of us, even in the 21st century, in contexts where there is not maybe always overt idolatry happening, this is a reminder to us that even the little things of life can be done in a God-honoring way. As I go to work, as I go to school, as I eat a meal, as I do my hobbies, whatever the thing might be, it can be done with a view towards God and what would honor Him, and a view towards others, how we can be considerate of them. And so really, same theme running through chapters 8 all the way through 14, that my freedoms, my choices should be done to glorify God and to help others. He ends the chapter again saying, do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, Christians, non-Christians, whoever it is, do it as a way of helping them. And he says again about himself, even as I try to please everyone in every way, for I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many so that they may be saved. Paul wants others to come to faith in Jesus. And he's willing to subjugate his own rights for their benefit. And he's inviting the Corinthians, he's inviting us to do the same. So let's do everything we can to glorify God and to help others.